Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reski.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
Welcome back to another episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm your host, Greg Bryan, and I am joined with my friend David Hurst. We recently reconnected. We've known each other for a long time, which we can talk about that. But we recently reconnected because I was doing a Bible study and I came across the issue of faith. I think 2 Corinthians 5:7 says we live by faith, not by sight. And I started thinking about different stories that I've heard through the years about, what does that mean? What does it mean what does it look like to live by faith? How does that actually work itself out? And I was reminded of a story that you told me that happened in your life. And so I reached out to you and we reconnected. And, I think that would be an appropriate place to begin. But before we dive into that story, I just want to welcome you to the show. And maybe you could just quickly introduce yourself.
My name's David Hurst, and like Greg mentioned, we've known each other since our college days at Kent State back in the mid 80s. And since then, the Lord has called us both into ministry. I worked for 25 years with China Outreach Ministries and Greg with the Navigators. Most of that time, I think for both of us, was at Kent State University also.
True. Yeah, and it was fun serving alongside each other. So David, you have this amazing story of faith, and it's hard to even think about where to begin. And every time I tell the story, people question whether or not it's true or not. So why don't you just tell our audience what happened?
Well, back in 1994, my wife and I were living in Canton, Ohio, and I was working as a chemist, but we were preparing to go to China, to the mission field. And the church that we were a part of in Canton, Ohio, Faith Community Church, they had asked me to join the missions committee. And in November of 94, as we prepared for the missions committee, they supported missionaries by faith promise, which I had never heard of faith promise. We had always just been part of churches that gave a certain percentage. But the idea behind their missions conferences was that everybody should have a role in missions. Everybody in the church should pray and ask what their role is, whether it's to go to the mission field, whether it's to pray faithfully for the missionaries, or to financially support the missionaries. And so the idea behind the Faith Promise Pledge wasn't just to make a pledge, but the idea was to really prayerfully put it before the Lord and ask, what is my role? And if He put an amount on your heart to give, trust that He would provide the money to fulfill that pledge over the coming year. But when it was originally explained to me, some of the other mission committee members said, well, you pray about it and then you figure out what you can afford and you make a pledge. And I thought, well, what if the Lord asks you to do something that you can't afford? If He's calling you to do something, He will provide for that. And yeah, there was a little bit of pushback, and even my wife supported me. She's like, well, if God tells me to pledge $1 million, I'm going to pledge $1 million. And one of the other members said, well, if I see a pledge for $1 million, I'm just going to rip it up because that's impractical. But my wife and I both felt convinced to put this before the Lord, and whatever He put on our hearts, we would make that pledge. And so originally I ended up pledging $1,500 over the coming year, which that was above and beyond our tithe. And we were a young couple with very small children. That was quite a stretch for us. And my wife looked at me and she says, "Okay, how did you come up with that number?" And I said, "Well, I prayed about it, but also I knew that we got periodic bonuses at the job I was working. And so I figured I would get about $800 in bonuses over the next year." And of course, my wife's response was, "Well, faith is being sure of what is unseen. If you see where the money's coming from, where's your faith in the faith promise?" So, so, or I originally pledged 1,000. So we prayed about it, and in the end, we end up pledging $1,500. So,
Okay, and I just want to reemphasize that point that this is above and beyond. You are already giving to the church and wherever
mhm,
you felt led. This was above and beyond um, what what you were what you thought you could afford, and $1,000 was very close because you knew you were going to get these bonuses. And
mhm,
so then, was it your wife or that challenged you to really take a step of faith? And so
mhm.
$1,500 back in the 1990s is a lot of money, especially for a young married couple with with a couple little
Yeah.
kids.
The other issue we were wrestling with is I mentioned that we were looking to go to the mission field, and um knowing, well, my parents and my grandparents had helped me out financially quite a bit when we were first married, and I just really wanted to pay them back and be out of debt before going to the mission field. And I mean, we owed them a lot more than that. And so yeah, so my initial response was, well, we should pay them off first. But I really felt convicted by the Lord that if he could provide the funds for the faith promise to provide for the missionaries, he could also provide the funds to pay my parents back, so we would be able to go to the mission field with no debt.
Okay, so you make the pledge, and then what happens? Do you have like several months to fulfill it, or is it like for the year?
This is a year-long pledge.
Okay.
And so, yeah, the idea is that we would give this amount over the coming year. And so, over the next year, sure enough, I got about $800 in bonuses and provided that for for the missionary fund. The following October, um, we our daughter was born, and we actually had to move out of our apartment, and so we ended up buying a house in Canton, Ohio. And at the end of October, as we were cleaning our apartment, the missionary conference was the first week of November. So as we were cleaning the apartment, I started thinking, okay, missions conference is a week away. I'm still $700 short on our pledge. And my oldest son was about 3 years old at that time. And so as I was cleaning the boys' bedroom, he unscrewed the knob on his closet door, the handle, and it's one of those bifold doors. So I actually had to get inside the door and close it to screw the knob back on. And on the back of the door there was a hole, and which you never would see unless you're inside the closet with the door shut. But I saw a little piece of paper. So when I pulled on the piece of paper, a roll of money fell out, and it was $700.
$700 exactly.
Yes.
I mean, it wasn't 705 or it wasn't 800 or it wasn't 600. $700. Seven, were they all $100 bills? Do you remember?
It was a very different bills, but it was
Okay.
exactly $700.
Now,
And
did you
actually,
make the connection right away? Like right way, like
well, I did, and I called my wife up and I said, "Look what we found." And she's like, "New carpeting, new linoleum for the house we just bought." And I said, "No, no, this is what the Lord provided for the faith promise pledge." And she agreed. Um, Actually, kind of the funny story at the end of this is after we had fulfilled our faith promise pledge, one of the elders at the church had a, he was doing construction, building new hotels, and he was in that process. He was given several hundred yards of linoleum and carpeting as scrap from the hotel, which was, you have a couple hundred yards of of carpeting, you end up with like 20 square yards or whatever. It was plenty for what we needed, but it wouldn't work in the hotel. So we end up getting free linoleum and carpeting in the end anyway.
Wow. Now that is
So,
pretty cool. That is pretty cool. That's part of the story I haven't heard. So your wife's initial thing is, oh, this will help our new house, and then all of a sudden this other guy donates all this material.
mhm.
That's amazing. Okay, so $700. That's pretty amazing. So then you take it and you fulfill your pledge of the $1,500, totally just exactly. And then what happens?
Well, I called my parents and my father was excited. He said, "Well, this is obviously a miracle." And we started talking about how the Lord did a bunch of very similar miracles the first time I went to China as a missionary. And but then the discussion kind of turned that, well, we still do owe them money. And I don't know, I was just kind of I felt really down about that. And so a few days later, I was working the afternoon shift, and then so I was planning to go there after work, like 10 o'clock at night, to finish cleaning the apartment. And on the way there, I just prayed for my parents that I would be faithful to serve God, and they would see that the Lord is taking care of me. And so when I got to the apartment, I went back up to that bedroom and I knelt down and I just started praying for my parents. And as I did so, the register on the wall fell off. And so this is the register where cold air returned back
Yeah.
down to the basement.
It
And
literally fell off. It fell off while you were like while you were praying.
yes, yes. And so I got down on my hands and knees, and it was an outside wall, and I reached down into the ductwork, and there was a shelf inside the ductwork. And I pulled out this old Norelco razor box, and we owed my parents $10,082. And there it was full of $100 bills, $10,000. And then there was 41 $2 bills, which I
No
always
way.
remember my mom always keeping the $2 bills. And so yeah, she liked the $2 bills. But anyway, so not only was it the exact amount, but I felt it was specifically aimed to show my parents that the Lord would take care of me.
Wow. I mean, this is amazing. Because I mean, it's one thing to find $700 in an old door behind, closet door or whatever. But then you literally reach down, you pull out this box, and you found $10,082 exactly.
Well, the odd part is my hands were shaking so bad that I actually ripped one of the $2 bills in half.
At least it was a $2 bill, not $100 bill. But
But when I got,
it was literally filled with like $100, like all $100 bills and then $2
yeah,
bills. And your mom
yes,
collects $2 bills.
yes. I mean, we always had an assortment of, she always collected odd money, and we always had coin collections when I was little. But yeah, I always remembered her keeping the $2 bills. And yeah, it was 10,082.
What was it
And
like? What was it like when you were like counting the money? Like what was going through your mind? Like,
like I said, I was in shock. My hands were shaking when I went back to the house that we had bought that night. My As soon as I walked in, Laurel just kind of looked at me stunned. She's like, "What happened? You're white. You look like you saw a ghost or something." And I was just stunned. I'm like, "Well," I just put out the money. I said, "Here's what happened." And yeah, I was in shock. I don't know how else to say it,
man.
but
But the thing is, think about this, like how many years before did the Lord put that exact amount of money
mhm,
in, hidden in there? And by the way, I've talked to you past this. You did try to track down the original owners and stuff like that, but it was
mhm.
so many management companies beyond, and basically they were like, if you find anything, it's yours.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like the previous owner was like, hey, I I just, they weren't, as far as nobody was looking for that money. But
Yeah, we had lived there several years, and actually the management company had changed three times while we lived there. So they had no records. And actually, that's kind of the weird next step. I did go to the manager, say, "Hey, we found this money." And they said, well, yeah, if they want it, they would have come back for it by now. By the way, they had already done the check of the apartment and they said, we want you to clean the basement a little bit better. Which, when I paid my parents back, yeah,
Okay, so let's talk about that. What was that phone call like when did you show up in person or was it a phone call?
oh, it was a phone call. And so I told my parents that I found the money.
Are they both
And
like on the phone or is it one at a time?
no, they were both on the phone. And yeah, again, it was a mixture of, well, this is great. No, this is clearly a miracle from God. But then there's the other side. Well, don't forget you still owe your grandmother money.
Wow. I mean, that is crazy. I mean, I mean, just to reiterate this, you literally owed them $10,082. It wasn't just 10,000. It wasn't, 8,000 or 12,000. It was literally, that was the exact amount.
Yes.
That is unbelievable. And then, so the phone call goes well. Your dad's like impressed again. Uh, but then your mom reminds you, or one of them
Mhm.
reminds you that, well, you still owe your grandma money. I'm guessing
Yes.
I'm guessing a good chunk of money. So then what happens?
So when I went to turn in the keys to the apartment, yeah, they asked me to go clean the basement a little bit better. So I went downstairs, and as I was in the basement, I started looking up at the ductwork where it came down, and
Yeah, I would be looking at every duct in that place if I was in your shoes.
but I did notice a section of the ductwork that was crooked, which it looked like somebody at some point had taken it apart, which I all the years we lived there that never.
Occurred to you.
Well, yeah, and why would it? I mean, but
Right.
anyway, so I took the ductwork apart at that point, and there were several jars and cans of money, and there was another $3,000, which was the amount that I owed my grandmother.
The exact amount.
The exact amount.
And
Yes.
oh my, it was this time the money was in jars.
Yeah,
And
jars and cans. Yeah, like yeah, well, it's a peanut jar and I think a little coffee can or something. But yeah,
okay, and at this point, like you had thought you were done with the apartment before you went back. You thought
yes,
you would like, okay, here's the keys, I'm done with it. But then they ask you to go back one more time.
yes,
And you recently had that phone call with your parents where they're like, well, remember you still owe your grandma some money. And was like, again, the likelihood, the chances of
mhm,
that, why couldn't they have just cleaned the basement themselves or had another company come in? They ask
yeah.
you to go back in, you go in and you find, so yeah. So what was the phone call like to your parents and what was it like? What did your grandma think?
Well, actually, I actually drove out to my parents then and delivered the money to my parents and my grandmother. And yeah, it's hard to even remember the conversation. Like I said, it was shock. I
Yeah.
mean, we had seen the Lord do amazing things, but this was not anything we had ever expected. And but I know there was concern about me going to the mission field. And I mean, no one growing up going to church, I mean, we were involved in a church growing up, but I wasn't really saved till about the time I went to college. And yeah, no one from our family ever went to be a missionary or anything. And yeah, this was an odd thing. And I know my parents sometimes struggled. Like I always did well in school. I was getting my chemistry degree, and they're like, "Okay, you're smart. Why would you give up chemistry to go to the mission field, to go to China?" And I think they just didn't understand that. But I think this was a way of God showing them that this was his calling on my life and he would take care of me. So,
Hmm. Well, um, that is an amazing story of faith and God's provision. And as I reflected on the story recently, I think one of the most um, probably even more important than the money that you found was how it helped launch you
Hmm.
into ministry. And I'd forgotten the part that you intended on actually going overseas as missionaries,
Hmm.
but it turned out that God had other plans, and he brought you to work with international students at Kent State, which Kent State had thousands of Chinese students at one point. And I know that, to me, just as I reflect on this story, I just think that, God used that experience to pave the way for you to touch hundreds, if not
Hmm.
thousands, of Chinese students with the good news of Jesus. And to me, that's the most beautiful part of the story. But is there anything else related to that story, or maybe you could reflect on how God did use that to launch you into ministry?
I think a couple points. One, I think just the idea of stepping out in faith. And I, a lot of people talk about, thinking outside the box. And I know Laurel and I, one of the phrases we like now is don't think outside the box. Just come to the realization there is no box and
Mm.
just get beyond our limitations because we have a God, that can do immeasurably more than all we can ask or imagine. And so if you can even imagine it, it's too small.
Wow.
And And so, I mean, one of the points here is like when I made the pledge, okay, I figured out where about $800 was going to come from, where the other $700 was going to come from. Over the next year, I prayed, okay, that I would get a raise or I would find a better job or I'd get a promotion. But those are ordinary ways. And if I would have gotten, if I say I would have gotten a big raise and given that money to the church, then all my Christian friends would, praise me for supporting the missionaries, and all my non-Christian friends would deride me for, throwing my money away. But the way this happened, I'm not the center of attention. God used my step of faith to draw attention to himself. And yeah, it was never to draw attention to me. He was going to use my step of faith to glorify himself. And um, yeah, one of the men I worked with as a chemist, he and I would have long debates. He was an atheist, and I remember right before I found the $10,000, we had this long debate at night, and we were good friends. And at the end, uh, I just remember him leaning back and he's like, "Ah, I just love debating with you, but I know," he said, he knew that I would never convince him there was a God, and he would never convince me that there is no God, but he just loved the debate. Well, a few days later, no, I was working the afternoon shift. We went out to dinner together, and he just sat there with his head down. I said, "What's going on?" And he says, "I can't look you in the face," which I thought was strange. I'm like, "Why?" And after just a little prodding, he finally looked up and said, "How can I say there is no God? He's made himself known." And that's the point. I could never debate him into the kingdom. And no matter what argument, I thought I had good arguments. But as he said, I was never going to convince him that there was a God. But when I took a step of faith, God didn't highlight me, he drew attention to himself. And I think that's one of the points. And also in the ministry over the years, I've told the story to I don't know how many international students on campus. And it's not only been, I think, encouraging to them, but it has been for me. In 25 years of ministry, we've had a lot of ups and downs. We've had a lot of spiritual attacks. There have been times when we have been pretty low, and it seems like always when I'm at my lowest, somebody comes up and says, "Hey, I heard this crazy story. Let me hear it again." And so I tell the story. And because the point is, if God calls you to do something, he will provide because he is faithful. And I cannot tell you how many times I've been at my lowest. And I finished that story and said, if God calls you, he will provide. God is always faithful. And I could hear the Holy Spirit saying, I just wanted to hear you say it out loud. I'm like, okay.
That's really cool.
So it was for me. Yeah, the Holy Spirit wanted me to tell the story to encourage me.
How did God use that story to launch you into ministry? I mean, it sounds like you had a pretty good job. It could have been very tempting for
Mm.
you to just, like you said, just be like, hey, my job is to make a lot of money and then I'll give it to missions. Um, if you want to go into the story about how God kind of shut the door on the mission field, you can do that, but just, um, yeah, how did you take that next step of faith?
Well, I mean, I had been, I was sure of the Lord's calling me into ministry. I mean, when I was a student at Kent State, um, is during, excuse me, it was during my freshman year that I became a believer. And it's really through the scientific evidence. But I was studying chemistry and physics, and it was during my sophomore year that I really decided that I should choose one, chemistry or physics. And so during the winter break, I was walking in a field behind my parents' house, and I put before the Lord and I prayed. And I asked the Lord, what should I dedicate my life to, chemistry or physics? And I heard China. And that wasn't one of the options. I honestly was not even expecting to hear anything, but it was very clear that. And so I just stopped and prayed. I said, if you're calling me to be a missionary to China, send me to China. So a few weeks later, I returned to Kent State to start the new semester. And a friend of mine who had led a Bible study when I was a freshman, he was a senior at that time. So I hadn't seen him in almost a year at this point. He came to visit me at Kent. And after we visited for the day, at the end of the day, he said, well, the real reason he came to see me is he had an opportunity to go to China that summer. And when he prayed about whether he should go, the Lord spoke to him and said that I was supposed to go with him. And so that was the confirmation that the Lord was calling me into the mission field. And so when we had, after my wife and I got married and I finished college, we were looking for opportunities to go to China. And so when the Faith Promise situation came up, we thought, okay, he took care of our debt, paid my parents back. He's cleared everything for us to go to China. And then my wife's visa was denied.
Mm.
And we were looking to go to China through OMF, where I would work in China as a chemist. Um, but in that process, we end up praying, okay, what is the next step? We thought the next step was actually going to China. And separately, both my wife and I felt convicted that the Lord was calling us to move back to Kent. And so when we told our pastor um, that this is where we felt the Lord was leading us and we were going to move back to Kent, that week the president of China Outreach Ministries called our pastor and asked him to pray that someone would start the ministry in Ohio at either Kent State, Akron, or Case Western. Those were their three targeted schools. And we knew people working with international students at Case Western and at Akron University, but we didn't know anyone working with international students at Kent. And we were both Kent alumni. And so we just felt like, yeah, this is what the Lord was calling us to. And so the Lord opened up that door. And January of 96, we joined China Outreach Ministries.
Wow. Yeah, and it was later that year that I joined the Navigators, and it took me a couple more years to get back to Kent State, but and I know when I came back to Kent State in the early 2000s, by that time you were hosting, like, there would be like hundreds of new Chinese students coming into campus, and you would host at your house in your yard, and your house was not that big. It certainly wasn't big enough to host a party of, uh close to 100 people, but you would have several hundred students
Yep.
in your yard, feeding them, some of the very first Americans that they met were you and your wife and
Hmm.
people that served on your team. And it was exciting for me to just see that. And I know that I've heard
Hmm.
just many, stories through the years. But yeah, do you want to reflect on? So you joined China Outreach Ministries, which that's a pretty cool story too. That you didn't even know there was a Chinese outreach ministry, I'm guessing.
No, no. But our pastor in Canton, um, his first job as a pastor years before, he was the youth pastor and the choir director at another church. And then his senior pastor went on to become the president of China Outreach Ministries. And so he had that relationship with the president of China Outreach Ministries. And
Okay.
so that's why they called. And actually, yeah, Glenn Osborne was our pastor, and several years later, actually Glenn Osborne became the next president of China Outreach Ministry. So our pastor later became our president
Oh, wow,
of
that's
the
cool.
ministry. So
That's
yeah.
really cool. So, tell me just in our time remaining, what were some of the other stories of faith? Let's keep the theme of faith going. Maybe like when you made that step, you moved back to Kent. Was there anything that happened in those first couple of years that comes to mind that you just answered prayer um, as you stepped out of faith? You know how God just continued to work around you.
Yeah, you mentioned the students coming to our house. A couple things to mention about that. When we first moved back to Kent, um, we rented a place, but we wanted to buy a house, and we looked at places close to campus and really concluded that we couldn't afford any place close to campus. And so we had tried buying a few houses, and they all fell through for one reason or another.
And
But
by the way, just a caveat here, because I've been in campus ministry, houses around campuses are very expensive. And a lot of that has to do with because they become rental houses, and so they become multi-income. They're investment properties. So there's a good reason why they're expensive, and it's very difficult to find an affordable house near campus. So anyway, continue on.
well, the house we ended up buying ends up it was owned by a student, and this is smart thinking by his father. His father said instead of paying rent, his father helped him go through the process of buying a house and said, while you're in college, pay the mortgage will be cheaper than the rent, and you have other students living with you. And so then when he finished college, he was ready to sell the house. But while he was a student, he became a believer also. And it's right next to campus, and he noticed that all how many Chinese students lived in the apartment complex there on Morris Road. And so we didn't know who this student was. He didn't know who we were. But the one week when our the one house we were looking to buy fell through, I just got a phone call out of the blue, and this guy said, "Hey, I'm Scott. I'm supposed to sell my house, and I think this would be a great place for ministry. I looked through the list of campus ministers, and you work with Chinese, and I think God wants you to have this house." I'm like, okay. So we went and looked at the house, and it's not the kind of house that we were looking at, but we had a list of all the things that we were looking for. And after looking at the house, I'm like, yeah, I'm not sure I like this house. And I just heard the Holy Spirit say, look at your list. And everything that was on our list that we were looking for, the backyard, and it 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 fit all our needs. And so we gave him an offer that was pretty far below market value. He countered with a lower offer,
Really?
which, yes. And he said he just felt convict convicted that the Lord wanted us to have that house. So when we met, so we met at the house and we discussed this. There was a knock at the door, and there was a Chinese lady at the door. And she said, I just arrived here from China. I don't know anybody. I need to find an apartment. Can somebody help me? And we said, okay. And so that day we helped her find an apartment. And Scott's like, yeah, see, God wants you to have this. This is be a good ministry house for the
Wow.
Chinese.
Now
And yeah,
that
she just
now if I was that guy's dad, I I I might be a little upset that he lowered how often do you hear somebody countering with a lower offer? That is crazy, but that is so cool
yeah.
because it shows you that he it's kind of his way of like urging you to buy that house. And I've been to that house, and it's right off campus. I mean, it's
Mhm.
location wise, it's like a wonderful location, walking distance, even from so much closer than so many of those apartment buildings. So anyway, that is really cool.
Hmm. Yeah. One more quick story about the Lord providing for these dinners. Yeah, we would have the new international student orientation every year. The students would come to our house for lunch. And yeah, we would have a couple hundred in the backyard, and they would come in shifts. And so, the the university would have their orientation, and like a third of them would come to our house immediately after orientation for lunch. They would take a third of them and they would do a campus tour, and the tour would end at our house. So like the first couple hundred were done eating by the time the second group came up. And then those were grad students who needed to go to Ravenna to get their social security card. Yeah, they would arrive later. So they came in shifts. So that's partially how we were able to do that. Um, but one of the cool things is it never rained on our picnic. Every year it forecasts rain, but it never rained on our picnic.
Yeah, and by the way, if it forecasts rain in Ohio, it's pretty almost a certainty because the typical forecast is overcast
Mhm.
and cloudy and overcast, but and it's again, being in campus ministry, I planned so many events that have gotten rained out. Um, it's just very easy. It never rained. That's amazing.
And do you remember, oh, it's about 20 years ago, the blackout from from Detroit to Buffalo?
I vaguely,
There,
yes, yeah, like a electrical blackout.
yeah, there's an electrical blackout for a week.
That happened on the day of your picnic.
It actually happened a few days before. And so that week I was going to the airport picking up students, and I was kind of arranging some things for the university because a lot of the students couldn't land in Cleveland because there was no power. So they were being rerouted to Toronto and other places. And so it was a wild week trying to figure out where the students were and getting them back there. But the interesting thing is, yeah, Kent was without power, as everything was from Detroit all the way to Buffalo, New York. The universities still had their power generators, so they still had their orientation. We had power throughout that. Our house had power. All the neighbors were without power that week. And so not only do we host all these international students, but even all our neighbors came because they couldn't go to work. And so even our neighbors came to the picnic because they couldn't go to work because their work was without power, their houses were without power, but somehow our little house on the corner there never lost power.
That is amazing. I,
So,
I did not know that story. That is crazy. That is crazy. Well, let's talk about like some individual lives, like, and I know you've got lots and lots of stories here, but um, again, maybe keeping people's names protected or whatever, or their identities protected. But what are some of just share a couple stories of like how you saw God draw students to himself.
hmm.
And then maybe those early days. or just some exciting moments. I know that you've baptized like lots and lots of students through the years.
Yeah.
So any testimonies like stand out to you?
Hmm. Well, okay. Let me sort through these in my head real quick. I mean, yeah, there we have literally seen hundreds of people come to know the Lord. And I, I owe a lot of that too, also not just what we were doing, but the people that the Lord put around us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I think one thing that really sticks out to me is the Chinese church. We started the Chinese church in 2001, and I think one of the interesting things was the people who had recently come to know the Lord were really committed to praying together. And we've had quite a few people come to the church to ask us to pray because they said you have a reputation that when you pray, the Lord answers your prayers. And people who are sick, people who are having children, and a lot of people praying, that either their spouses' visas would get approved or their parents' visas would be approved. That was one of the things that was different back then. When we started the ministry, we most of the scholars were older and many of them were married, but almost all of them were Communist Party members, and so most of them, their spouses were not allowed to come because that was the guarantee that they would return to China once they got their degree.
Mm.
And so, having people come to us and pray, have us pray that their spouse would get their visa. Yeah, we quickly got a reputation that the Lord answers the prayers of the Chinese church in Kent. And
Wow.
actually, I heard one student who was well, for a while he was the head of the Chinese Student and Scholar Association, and um he was planning a big picnic for one of their Chinese celebrations, one of the Chinese holidays. And one of the other students commented, he was not a believer at that point. But they asked him, they're like, well, what's your backup plan in case it rains? He says, oh, we're going to invite David because if David's coming, it's not going to rain on our picnic.
That's funny. And did you go?
uh, I did. Um, I'm not sure if I went to that one or not. To be honest, I don't
Yeah, you
remember.
don't remember. You don't
But
remember. That is pretty amazing. Yeah. If
but it's fun hearing the stories from other students that that saying this is what the other students say.
yeah. Yeah. Now, did you find that like the Chinese students that you worked with, was God at work in their hearts way before you met them? Like, were they already kind of like seeking um
It I think it varied from over time. It we saw a huge difference over 25 years of ministry experience. As I mentioned, when we started the ministry, almost all the scholars that we worked with were in their 40s and 50s, and most of them, no, this was late 80s, early 90s, so most of them had grown up um, as a small child, been through the Cultural Revolution, and then during the 70s, the well, they call it the lost generation because there was no education system for a while in China. And so, yeah, a lot of those people were had been through some very difficult times in China, and a lot of them were very disillusioned with the Communist Party. But they had been taught the Communist Party is everything. It's your religion, it's your philosophy, it's your political system, it's everything for to you. But they were disillusioned with that, and so they would say, no, we're just looking for something to believe in. And so they seemed very hard to convince. Um, but once they accepted Christ, they were completely sold out. And that's a big shift because like later, um, like towards the end of our time at Kent, we started seeing more undergrad students. And 25 years later, a lot of the ones who were coming as undergrads were there because their parents had money. And, you know, the people who came in the beginning, though, those were China's best and brightest. And a lot of the ones coming later, they came because their parents had money and they were spoiled and um, weren't always committed to their studies and really more postmodern in their thinking. And so, yeah, it was a different it was a different mode of ministry throughout that time. And as a scientist, I think one of the biggest shifts for me is like in the beginning, most of the people I worked with were scientists. And no, they're like, well, show me the evidence.
Yeah.
And so we would go through the scientific evidence. And they wanted evidence. They didn't want to talk about faith. And I think one of the big turning points was later in the ministry, working with some of these young kids. And as science progressed, it became there's much more evidence for a creator, intelligent design. The those arguments were much more developed, and just the volume of evidence for a creator um, has grown so much that instead of saying, "Show me the evidence, don't show me faith," they're like, "Well, yes, all the evidence points to there being a God, but we have faith that through time the humans will be able to come up for an answer without God." And I'm like, wow, so you're completely opposite. You're going against the evidence and relying on faith in humanity. And while that was a big shift to hear that. And it, it was it was shocking.
Wow. Yeah, that's very interesting. Um, well, we're coming to the end of our time here. Any final thoughts you want to share related to the topic of faith or just something that we've touched on today?
Hmm. Yeah, I think for me, another point about when I found the money, I remember leading a Bible study about Jesus walking on water. And kind of one of the points that really struck out to me is Peter walked on water. And, he grew up his whole life. He was a fisherman. He grew up his life on the water. He never dreamed that he would walk on water. And I just remember asking the Lord, I'm like, what's the point that you want me to take away from this? And I was nervous about going into the ministry. I mean, I'm an introvert and um yeah, the idea of being a minister was scary. But I think the Lord used that to assure me. He says, don't worry about what you're going to do because you can't even imagine what you're going to do. I'm going to do things that are beyond your comprehension. And yeah, just thinking of myself as an introvert who never wants to be around crowds of people, I've never become fluent in Chinese, but not only has he used me to minister to thousands of students, seeing hundreds come to know the Lord, but he used me to plant a Chinese church, which I'm not fluent in Chinese. How am I supposed to start a Chinese church? But that's what he led me to do, and we did it, and the church is still going strong. We started IFC, which I think when we left Kent to go to Ohio State, we had, I think, 14 churches and almost 700 volunteers working with international students. And just the Lord has expanded on what he has called us to do. And yeah, it's not anything I would ever imagine. And so I, you know, was it Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, because our understanding and our vision is just so small. And again, going back to Ephesians, to him who's able to do immeasurably more than all you can ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. To him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus. And just the idea, if you can imagine it, it's too small. God says you can't even begin to imagine what I'm going to do. So trust me.
Well, thank you very much, David. I really appreciate it. It's fun to talk with you. I appreciate you sharing that, and may God use your stories to encourage people to trust God in a deeper way.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.